Stories, music, life. BBC WM
95.6.
Radio for the West Midlands.
Now it's Tuesday and it's time for our real life story, and today I'm talking to someone whose life was changed forever after one of the biggest scandals in the history of the NHS. Now, Sue Threakall's husband Bob was one of 7,500 people to receive contaminated blood products in the 70s and the 80s. You may remember the scandal. Patients were wrongfully given blood imported from America that hadn't been properly screened. Now, Bob contracted HIV because of his treatment and died in 1991, aged just 47. Now, his widow, Sue, has spent the last 30 years campaigning for other victims, and she joins me now. Good afternoon, Sue.
Hi, Caroline. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you very much for coming on and talking about this, Sue. I mean, I know that we've said you're from Erdington, which you are, but you're down in Devon now, aren't you?
At the moment, yeah.
Right, we'll get to...
But I was born and bred in Erdington.
Born and bred, so you know it well then.
I do.
Excellent. Well, take us back then to when you first met Bob, Sue. I mean, how did you meet? What kind of man was he?
First of all, before I start on that, can I just correct you on your figures?
Yeah.
Because it's 4,800-ish, just under 5,000 mark, haemophiliacs that contracted viruses through contaminated blood products. All of them contracted hepatitis C, and of those, call it 5,000, 1,200 also contracted HIV, and he was one of the unfortunate ones that got both, plus hepatitis B.
Right, well, thank you for that correction, Sue.
Now, when I met him originally, I was actually working, I think I just finished college. I had. And I was doing a sort of holiday job initially, and then I stayed on in an office in Handsworth Wood. And he was, it was part of the civil service, ironically, and he was an executive officer there, and basically his best friend started going out with my sister, who also worked there, and they eventually got married. I did know that Bob had got haemophilia, but I didn't really understand it or know much about it. He just sort of limped a bit, and that was the extent of what we knew, really. He was best man at their wedding, and I was chief bridesmaid, and we all used to kind of go out in a group, you know, socially. I knew him for years before we actually got together properly and got married. He had two sons from his previous marriage. He was actually divorced when I met him. And eventually in 1981 we got married, and his two boys came to live with us. He had custody of them. And in 1983 we had our own son too.
Right, okay. So you've mentioned the haemophilia. Can you just explain to people that don't understand what it is, exactly, you know, what is it? Yeah.
Well, essentially, we have different proteins in our blood, and one of those proteins helps the blood to clot. And that protein is missing in people with haemophilia. Now, people kind of get the wrong end of the stick and think, oh, they've cut the finger, they're going to bleed to death, and that isn't true. I mean, basic first aid applies with haemophiliacs as well. What happens is that they actually bleed for longer. It's not that they suddenly start gushing fountains of blood, it's just that they bleed the same as us, only for longer. And that's not so bad if it is a cut on the finger, because you can deal with that with pressure and, if necessary, steri strips or stitches or whatever. The problem really arises when they get internal bleeding. Now, that can arise one of two ways. Either completely spontaneously, they can be sitting watching the television one day and say, ow, I think I've got a bleed coming in my knee, my ankle, my elbow, or whatever. It's usually a joint. Or it can be as a result of a trauma, like a fall, or just a little bump can set it off, really. Most haemophiliacs have got what they call target joints, very often ankles, because obviously they take a lot of pressure. And a target joint will bleed, and then it will be settled, and they'll be okay for a bit, and it will bleed again, you know, and so on. In the early days, before I knew Bob, there was no treatment, or no regular treatment for this at all. So it was basically rest, cold compresses, you know, the sort of thing you and I would do really if we got a sprained ankle or something. But obviously when you've got blood going into the joint and not stopping, I mean, the pain levels are just extraordinary. You know, I've seen so many grown men just weep with the pain. Essentially it damages the joints. It then sets up arthritis, which is why so many older haemophiliacs have dreadful problems with arthritis in their knees, ankles, elbows, and so on. they used to use things like snake venom.
Snake venom?
Yeah, because snake venom actually contains a clotting agent.
Right, I see.
Yeah. I don't know how effective it was as a treatment, but they used to try everything, really. I know that Bob's mum used to tell me stories about when he was little. He would spend weeks in bed. He was a brilliant chess player, and the reason he was so good is that she used to sit up with him all night when he was in pain and taught him to play chess. And it kind of went from there. He also had a little hole he'd gouged away in the wall of his bedroom, apparently by the side of his bed, where his imaginary mouse friend used to live when he was a little boy. And apparently his dad, whenever he redecorated, had to paper around the hole.
Oh, it must be so hard, though, seeing somebody you love in so much pain.
Well, yeah, but by the time I met Bob, interestingly enough, in 1964, before I met him, cryoprecipitate was invented. Now, that was essentially fresh frozen plasma. Sorry, I'll never say that. And it used to come in big bags and was infused into patients over a period of time. They had to go to hospital to have it done. It was time-consuming, but it worked because as it was fresh frozen plasma, it contained that protein that was missing. And, you know, that was a huge move forward in haemophilia treatment. However, in the 70s, they started developing concentrates. Now, concentrates, basically, what they would do, and still do, is to pool literally tens of thousands of blood donations into huge vats. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen it on the television, but it looks disgusting. The recent Panorama programme showed it very graphically. They literally tip it all together, and it's freeze-dried, and they extract the little bit that is needed, which is then reconstituted with water. Now, obviously, people could then start treating at home. It was far more convenient. It worked very, very well. But what happened was that because there were so many donors in that pool, the chances are that at least one of them, and probably more, would be carrying viruses. We've known since the 1930s and 40s that blood would carry hepatitis, or as I used to call it then, jaundice. There were various warnings in the 1970s. 1974, I think it was, the World Health Organization warned all countries, including Britain, to become self-sufficient in blood products as quickly as they possibly could because of the risk of hepatitis. There were 2 warnings from them. There was also a letter from a gentleman called Dr. Garrett Allen, who warned about, that was in 1969, gave a written warning of the increased chance of viral agents when pooled blood manufactured from donations was taken from skid row donors. And that happened particularly in America, where they paid people to donate their blood. Now, in this country, we don't do that. It's given altruistically. So the chances are the people that give it are going to be honest about what they've got.
Yeah.
If you're in a position in life where you've got to sell your blood, you're not going to be particularly honest if they ask you whether you've had any episodes of jaundice recently, or have you ever slept with anyone that's got HIV or whatever. And
that is true, isn't it? Because if you're that desperate that you need to make cash from selling blood,
say whatever it takes,
you will actually say whatever. Now, I mean, Bob was having treatment, and shortly before he met you, he was transferred to something called Factor 8, which, of course, would end up being at the heart of the tragedy. What is Factor 8 then, Sue?
Well, Factor 8 is what I explained a minute ago. Basically, the freeze-dried product. So it comes in very small bottles, a couple of inches high. It's like a sort of little white solid lump, and it's reconstituted with distilled water and then injected using a big syringe and a butterfly needle, which can be done at home. It was interesting that Bob started on Factor 8 in October 1977. He wasn't given any information about it. This is kind of 11 years after Dr. Garrett Allen's warnings. And several years after the World Health Organization warnings. We knew nothing about it, he knew nothing about it, about the dangers of it, or the possible dangers. And basically, the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation had made a decision from around about the late 70s, around about 1977, to deliberately phase out the use of cryoprecipitate and to rely more and more heavily on the concentrate, which we couldn't keep up with the production of, and so they had to import. Now, interestingly, from Bob's notes, the month after he was put on, he was actually transferred to Factor 8, they wrote in his notes that despite being a severe haemophiliac, he's not recently had many severe bleeds and has not required any Factor 8 replacement therapy for many months.
So when did you first realise that something was wrong then? I mean, what happened to Bob to make you start worrying?
Well, nothing specifically happened to Bob except that he was very reluctant to treat himself. I mean, before we got married, he got a bleed and I said, well, why don't you just inject with that stuff, because I knew very little about it. And he said, I don't like doing it unless I absolutely have to. You don't know what's in it. Mm. Now, if he could work that out as a man in the street, it's quite clear that the people that actually were supposed to know what they're doing would have known exactly what was in it, and it's proved that they did. And time has proved that.
So Bob would develop hepatitis B, then
Well,
C.
he developed that just before we got married, and they said, it's hepatitis B, it's sort of a jaundice thing, it's a very mild thing, doesn't cause any problems, it'll go away in a few weeks. Now, nothing can be further from the truth. I mean, hepatitis can lead directly to cirrhosis of the liver. It's a killer. Right. Not in every case. It's probably, if you're going to get hepatitis, it's probably one of the better ones to get, but it's not good at all, He developed that, and they admitted that was from the treatment, and the attitude was kind of, you take the rough with the smooth, the benefits outweigh the downside of it, you put up with this for a little bit and you'll be fine. What we didn't know at the time was that from the very first infusion of Factor 8, Bob and every haemophiliac in the country had also contracted hepatitis C. Now, it is a known fact that it was a pretty well 100% seroconversion from the first treatment. So already, by the time we got married, unbeknown to us, he'd got hepatitis C and hepatitis B.
And then in 1985, the doctors told you that he'd also contracted HIV.
HIV in 1985, yeah. Now, that was around about the time of all the government tombstone adverts and, all that sort of stuff, and celebrities dying, like Rock Hudson and so on. And the level of stigma and, sheer panic, really.
Well, it's not like today, is it, where people with HIV can, live relatively normal lives? Effectively, this was a death sentence, wasn't it?
Oh, it was a death sentence. People were told various things, like, go ahead and just do what you want to do because you won't be around in a couple of years' time. Go and spend all your money. I wouldn't worry about school, university, college, whatever. Just go off and do what you need to do because, you will be dead in a couple of years. And that's kind of the message they got. The only advice we were given when Bob came and told me his results, I said, well, what did they say? Because at the time we were trying for another baby. And he said, just use a condom and tell Sue not to get pregnant for 2 years.
But it's amazing, Sue, that you didn't, if you were trying for a baby prior to this, that you didn't contract it yourself.
Oh, it's unbelievable. I was very fortunate. Other people weren't so fortunate. I know of at least 2 families where a child was orphaned because the mother also contracted HIV from the father. And it was for exactly the same reason that had I contracted it, would have happened in our family, and that was the delay in giving out the test results.
Yeah.
And the lack of education and information. They used, okay, fair enough. The average junior doctor probably wouldn't have known a lot about it and wouldn't have fully understood the implications of what was going on. But I remain convinced, and nothing will ever change my mind on this, that the senior doctors, and in particular the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation, knew exactly what they were doing.
Now, but you ended up having to give up your teaching job just to care for Bob, to look after Bob, and you had to relocate down to Devon, didn't you, as well?
No, I relocated long after Bob died. No,
right.
We were in Erdington when he died. I got a really good job, which I absolutely loved, as a deputy head in Erdington, deputy head of a primary school. But the pressures of trying to do that job and deal with what was going on at home just basically became too much. Call me a wimp if you like, but
Nobody could call you that. Working in that and looking after the children as well, and your husband. That's really full on, Sue.
Yeah, well, at that point, you see, Bob was still working himself, but it was absolutely intolerable at home because, having spoken to a lot of women, I mean, we've all agreed that probably because of a mixture of the physical and mental issues with the illness, and also having to kind of deal with home life as well, the men became, or many of the men became so difficult to live with on a daily basis because they were so frightened, and your whole life outside work was wrapped up with what was going on with that, because every little cough or sniffle, it was, oh God, is this it? Has he got pneumonia? Has he got this? Has he got the other? And in the summer of 1990, I decided to give up work because it was clear to everybody that Bob's health was deteriorating really rapidly. He stuck it out at work as long as he possibly could. He loved his job like I did, and he loved his colleagues, and he wanted to continue for as long as he possibly could. But he was so very ill, and from about October, November that year, he wasn't able to go to work. I carried on doing relief teaching and other jobs as and when, but it did give me the flexibility then to be with him when he was particularly poorly.
And sadly, Bob died in 1997, aged 47. I mean, it must have been awful at the end.
Yeah, 1991.
1991.
He was just off work for a few weeks. Yeah, it was. I mean, he essentially in the autumn of 1990. He was having a lot of problems with his chest, breathing difficulties, cough and so on. And he went to his treatment centre. They did an X-ray. They picked up shadowing on both lungs. Now, I had that a few months ago, and they did chest X-rays, scans, antibiotics. I had to go to the asthma clinic to get checked out for that, and all sorts of investigations. And that's me as a normal person. And yes, I know it's 30-odd years later. But I had pneumonia when my son was little, and it was the same sort of thing. You have all the right treatment and the invasive treatment that is necessary. With Bob, who was at very, very high risk of developing what's called PCP pneumonia, he got shadowing on both lungs, and they did absolutely nothing. He had no antibiotics, no treatments of any sort, no physio, no return visits to the hospital. So by the time Christmas came, he was like a walking skeleton.
That must have been so hard to see him going through that for you all as a family.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if I'd known then what I know now, I would have kicked up such a fuss. But haemophiliacs in particular were very, very trusting of their doctors, because mostly from birth they've been used to being in a hospital environment, and they've accepted all the blood tests and the investigations and, days and days in a hospital bed and so on. And they were always very respectful to their doctors. And a lot of the problem at the moment we're finding is that the absolute devastation people are feeling when these people who they felt of really as an extended family member, that they realised what they knew at the time, and the fact that they were basically using those guinea pigs.
Listen, we're going to catch up with this and get the rest of this story. Just have 5 minutes now, Sue, if that's all right with you, because I need to get the news and the travel.
So do you want me to hold on the line?
You hold on the line a bit. We'll come back. We'll play the travel, get the news headlines, and then we'll come back and talk to Sue, who is from Erdington, whose husband Bob was a victim of the contaminated blood scandal of the 70s and 80s. And coming up after the news headlines and the travel, we're going to hear how Bob's death shattered Sue's family, her decades of campaigning to expose the truth behind the tragedy, and how an inquiry into the scandal has finally been announced. So that is all to come.
BBC WM
95.6
Radio for the West Midlands.
25 minutes to 1 o'clock, and we're in the middle of this week's real life story. And I'm talking to Sue Threakall, who's originally from Erdington. Sue's life, as we heard, changed forever in 1991 when her husband Bob died after contracting HIV from contaminated blood imported from America that was meant to be treating his haemophilia. Now, the blood hadn't been properly screened, and thousands of people were wrongly treated with it in the 70s and 80s in what remains one of the biggest scandals in the history of the NHS. So, Sue, thanks for holding on there.
Yeah, no problem.
And joining me again. So, picking up where we left off, Sue, Bob died in 1991. I mean, You've got a child together, you've got two stepsons. So, talk to me about the immediate aftermath of this. I mean, the impact that it had on all of you.
Well, it was catastrophic, but I think it was made more so because of the handling of Bob's death by the hospital, in that I genuinely didn't know that he was so ill. I knew he was very poorly, but we hadn't been told that he was actually terminal and supposedly receiving palliative care. I only found that out some time after from a letter in his notes that went to our GP, basically saying there was nothing else they could do, and that was it. I had him admitted to hospital. He was due to go in anyway on the Monday to see if they could fit a nasogastric tube to try and get some nutrition into him. But by the Sunday, he was navy blue and could barely breathe. So I kicked up a fuss. We just took him straight over there. And the doctor that admitted him looked him up and down, looked at me and said, well, he doesn't look as ill as you said he was on the phone.
And that was
dead 2.5 days later.
Goodness gracious.
Because when they actually x-rayed him, they found out that he got hardly any normal lung tissue left.
So it came out of the blue. You were expecting him to go in and then come back home again?
Well, yeah. Yeah, so we had to get his middle son back from university. We all managed to get to the hospital, but it was absolutely horrific.
Now, I do appreciate, so that this has been a very long journey, but when did you realise that there'd been a terrible mix-up by the NHS? I mean,
it's not a mix-up. It isn't a mix-up. It was at least done knowingly, and I would suggest quite deliberately. Can I read you something that will just about sum it up? It's a letter from 1982 to all the haemophilia centre directors in the country, and it's from the UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Organisation. It says, although initial production batches may have been tested for infectivity by injecting them into chimpanzees, it's unlikely that the manufacturers will be able to guarantee this form of quality control for all further batches. It is therefore very important to find out by studies in human beings to what extent the infectivity of the various concentrates has been reduced. The most clear-cut way of doing this is by administering those concentrates to patients requiring treatment who have not previously been exposed to large pool concentrates. And so it goes on. And essentially what they did was to identify those patients who had never received commercial products, and by default that was babies, very young children, very mild haemophiliacs who actually didn't need that sort of treatment, and on whatever excuse, and we've heard a lot over the years, they injected them. And in one particular trial they had 14 children and babies. The oldest was 18, most of them were 3, 4, 5 months old, and out of those 14, 11 of them developed hepatitis C, and we've never been able to find out how many got HIV.
Goodness gracious. Now, I mean, you're chairwoman of the campaign.
No, I'm actually secretary now. We continually have reshuffles to give people a break, so I'm back down.
You're back down to being the secretary now. Well, the time will come round again. You'll be the chairwoman again.
Oh God, I hope it doesn't go on that long, please.
But it's the campaign group Tainted Blood, and I know that you have spent years meeting other victims of this scandal, haven't you? And sadly, you've been to a lot of funerals too.
So I've lost count of how many. I've been to 3 in one family, 3 brothers.
Right. What led you into this? I mean, because you wanted to, you wanted to see change, you wanted to meet other people.
No, it's not about meeting other people. Although that's been lovely. I've met some great people, but no.
I mean that have been on the same journey as you, that have seen what you. Because I mean, your story. That the other people have had to go through this as well is absolutely heartbreaking, to go through what you went through. I mean, everybody must take this. Well, there must be still so much anger.
Oh, absolute anger and repressed feelings as well. I mean, I think if we ever get an end to this, it won't be an end, if you know what I mean, because once it's over, people have got to deal with the fallout. And I see Tainted Blood's job as preserving the history of this and preserving the stories, you know, creating a legacy so that future generations can see exactly what happened, which is what we try and do as we go along. No, Bob and I were called on along with a lot of other people to do some press work. We said we were happy to do it in about 1985, and that was for the Haemophilia Society. And Bob really enjoyed doing it, actually, and we used to do quite a bit. And then after he died, I did the odd thing. When Tainted Blood was set up, and that was by two friends of mine, Andy Evans and Gareth Lewis, who sadly passed away a few years ago. It had been going a few weeks, and it was basically just a website to start with, and I contributed a few posts. Andy gave me a call and said, would I be interested in going on the committee, and it kind of all went from there, really.
Right, I see.
And Andy's our current chair.
He's your current chairman. Probably going to be the secretary next year when you all change around again. So,
I don't know.
Now, I know that an inquiry has finally been announced, but throughout all of this, I mean, were you given help and support? Was there any there for you?
There have been a series of ex gratia payments over the years, so it would be unfair to say there has been no money awarded. There has, but by their own admission, the government have deliberately kept a huge proportion of the group slightly above the poverty line. And you have to take into account that people have lost homes, either by not being able to afford the mortgage because they can't work anymore, or because they lost their career like me, or haven't got full pensions or any pensions. They can't get life insurance. So financially, many people have lost huge amounts of money. And some trust funds were set up, initially a fund for the haemophiliacs with HIV and a smaller fund for a few people that had contracted HIV through transfusions. When the hepatitis C issue became larger, they also set up funds for that, but it's a complete mishmash. I think it's about 5 different funds which are due to be condensed down into one according to the latest government plans. But government will tell you, and they undoubtedly have, that this government has done more than any other government for victims, and that they have more than doubled the spend, etc., etc., etc. What they've actually done is given into pressure, justifiable pressure from victims, that those who contracted hepatitis C should be getting a regular ongoing payment. Well, what they've done is to fund that payment by taking money away from those who are arguably the worst affected, those who have also got HIV. And so if that goes ahead, by the end of this year, they will be down by about £4,000. I've got friends who don't know if they're going to be able to keep their home. I've got other friends who know they won't be able to. Right, and
is this in part why you went down to Devon? Because we know that you're living there now. You downsized. Was that in order to make ends meet?
Not so much at the time. No. It was for work.
Right. And how has life been for you and for your family? I mean, you're obviously still involved very much in this, but how have you and your children, how have you coped? How have you got by?
Well, Bob's older son and I have always had a really good relationship, although we don't see an awful lot of each other now. His middle son chose to completely isolate himself from everyone. He's since got married, and I believe he's very happy, which is lovely, you know. His younger son, our son together, has been through a very long, difficult period. He's now 33, nearly 34, gradually coming out of it now, living closer to me. But, you know, it has been extremely difficult for all the families involved. You know, you hear so many stories about mental health problems, people self-harming, suicide attempts. You know, I could go on for hours about the effects on families. But they have been quite catastrophic, and all the government have ever done is to give out what's called ex gratia payments, which basically means no liability admitted. You can't, you know, we constantly hear the word compensation. No compensation has ever been afforded at all, because to give compensation you have to have an admission of liability, and there has been none, or to prove liability, which is one of the things we hope will come out of an inquiry.
Well, last week an inquiry into this scandal was finally announced. What do you want from that, Sue? An apology? Money? What do you want from that?
I think I could probably speak for everybody when we say that the essential thing we want to come out is the truth, because we want to be vindicated. I'm fed up with people saying to me, "Oh, you're only in it for the money," or things like, "Why don't you move on?" I've heard that today. Stop living in the past. It isn't about living in the past. It's not about not moving on. It's about the fact that this dreadful injustice took place. A vulnerable group of people in the UK were deliberately, in my opinion, selected and used as guinea pigs. And because of that, many of them, over 2,000 of them have so far lost their lives. The rest have had their lives absolutely torn apart. And I think in order to protect future generations from this sort of thing happening again, and in order to kind of do honour to those who've lost their lives, we have to get to the root of why these decisions were allowed to go through.
Do you think that if you get the truth, do you think then you will get closure? Do you think that you will be able to, as you say, somebody was mentioned today, move on?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't got any problem with moving on, but I think we'll all be content to, as I said, actually be vindicated and be able to hold our heads up and have people say, well, actually, yeah, you were right. We thought you were barking mad at the time, but, quite frankly, it was really awful. Because it does sound far-fetched. If you say that doctors have deliberately targeted babies and children to inject known infected products into, people are going to look at you and say, well, that wouldn't really happen.
Yeah. And, well, this remains one of the biggest scandals in the history of the NHS. I mean, the NHS...
I think it's the biggest.
Yes. The NHS does get a lot of flack, but we must remember that it does do some amazing work too. But that said, how do you feel about doctors and healthcare in general?
Well, I've had some fantastic care. I've had wonderful care down here where I've had a hip replacement and knee replacement. But on the other hand, I am always vigilant, always very careful. And, for example, I will always write on consent forms and so on that I don't wish to be given any blood or blood products whatsoever unless it's a life or death situation. It's made me very wary, and very, not cynical exactly, but although I probably am that as well. But it's made me conscious that things aren't always as sweet and nice as they come over, that there may well be a hidden agenda.
It's interesting because I was talking to producer Brett, who you've talked to about this before, and he said, do you have any recollection of this? And do you know what? Vaguely in the back of my mind, I must have.
That's what a lot of people say.
But I do remember that when I had my son, who is now 17, they wanted me to have a blood transfusion, and I refused it. And there was a reason why I refused it, and it must have been all linked to what I'd known about this or what I'd read about this at the time.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I had a hemorrhage the week after I had David, and being the awkward person that I tend to be on occasion, I flatly refused to go back into hospital. They wanted me to go back in. And I wouldn't, so they had to come out every day and treat me at home, but they would obviously have given me blood in hospital. Yeah.
I mean, we call this spot, Sue, our real-life story spot, but how do you look back on the story of the last 30 years of your life?
I've met some amazing people. I've done a lot of stuff that isn't at all connected with this. It's not like I've devoted my entire life to it, like some people seem to think, but I do spend a lot of time on it, as do many of us. It has been extremely frustrating. It's been absolutely soul-destroying on occasion, like when we take a lot of time and trouble putting together a dossier full of information and full of proof and evidence and so on. Then we get a letter back saying, thank you for your communication. It has been passed on to the relevant departments. I could paper the walls with those sort of things. We've constantly felt like we've been banging our head against a brick wall. And the one thing I would like to say is that for this inquiry to work, it should have no involvement whatsoever from the Department of Health. We cannot have the department that were responsible for this, I believe culpable, and involved in it all the way through, calling the shots for who runs the inquiry and what the terms of reference are and so on, because if that happens, it's doomed to fail from the outset.
Listen, Sue, I do thank you for joining me this afternoon, and I genuinely I hope that you get the answers that you seek. And
I'll keep you posted.
Do talk to us again. All right, Sue.
Yeah, thanks ever so much.
Thank you very much. That is Sue Threakall there telling her real life story here on BBC WM. Sue, whose husband died in 1991, the result of being given contaminated blood prescribed by doctors on the NHS. And after 30 years, the Prime Minister Theresa May has announced a formal inquiry into the scandal.